So Mike, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we go into leadership, can you tell us a little bit more about your own background? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Nick. First of all, really chuffed to be on the show with you. I grew up in the East Rand of Johannesburg, so I'm a Johannesburger born and bred, and in a relatively small town called Benoni.
Like Charlize Theron.
Just like Charlize, that is our one and only claim to fame. So yeah, I will take it. My mom is a school teacher, public school teacher. My dad he qualified as a diesel mechanic by trade. My mom is still in the same school today that she taught in when I grew up, and my dad has just recently retired from the construction industry. Yeah, so neither of them are entrepreneurs, which is why I share that particular piece of detail. I fell into entrepreneurship quite by mistake, I guess.
So what kind of mistake was it? Or what was your dream career?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I had a dream career. I was that kid at school who didn't know what they wanted to do. I was a bit of a generalist, right? Like I cared about everything a little. I knew about a lot of things, but not very well. I was interested in a broad variety of topics, but not an expert in any one thing. And in a weird way, that lent itself very naturally to the world of entrepreneurship when I finally found my way into it. So I worked a couple of very odd jobs after dropping out of university. I did some sales gigs. I worked in the church for a short time, which was interesting because it taught me a lot about community and how to speak. And then later on, landed up working for a company that sold earth-moving spare parts, a very entrepreneurial business. So although the product wasn't really something that I cared deeply about, the type of business that I discovered when I worked for them was. And it was a business that was very open and very collaborative, very transparent, highly performance-oriented, very much around people and their fulfillment. And I got to experience so much of what it meant to work in different parts of that organization, whether it was sales or marketing or finance or even in people management. And so developed a real passion for entrepreneurship in that environment.
So you were kind of a GM?
Well, in that business, I started off as a telesales agent and then kind of worked my way up as a marketing assistant, but helped them develop a couple of new lines of products, helped build our teams, and in doing so, worked with a variety of different departments. Or when a business is that size, the generalist will often find a way to inject themselves into different parts of the organization, and that was something that I really enjoyed and found very stimulating.
So how did you get into the world of social media?
Yeah, also by accident. I'm one of the luckiest guys you'll ever meet. I stumbled upon blogging. I used to follow Dr. Graham Codrington's work, and they were very early adopters of blogging as a platform, and sort of discovered blogging through that, and then realized I could use it to blog myself and to share insights and opinions online, which is both great and also terrifying, as we've come to realize looking back on 13 or 14 years of social media in the world and the impact it's had on the world. But yeah, I love the fact that even though I didn't have a journalism degree or that I'd never written for a paper or a magazine, I suddenly had the opportunity to share opinions and be published and develop an audience, and that really appealed probably primarily to my sense of ego, but also I found that audience, and in doing so realized that what I was discovering would probably have an impact for a lot of brands and their customers, and also employers and their employees. And so the idea for Cerebra, a business that would help organizations to navigate some of the opportunities and challenges of the social media era, was born. And I started that business, and it started very slow. It took 6 or 7 months to really gain momentum. I racked up a lot of debt very quickly, but I learned a lot of lessons as well, and luckily that business was something that was of value to me, to the people that worked there, and ultimately to the people who purchased it, and I look back very fondly on those years.
Well, you built Cerebra into Africa's leading social media agency. Can you maybe share a couple of highlights of your Cerebra journey?
Wow, yeah, it's difficult to summarize 12 or 13 years into a few highlights, but there are certain inflection points that happen when you build a business that later, when you look back on, seem a lot bigger than they probably did at the time, and you never really appreciate the gravitas of those moments at the time. But there were a couple of partnership moments in the early part of our business. collaborating with other people to start the business, making tough decisions about who would stay part of it going forwards, hiring our first employee, firing our first employee. Those are things that are big lessons very early on. Losing big client contracts because we realized we were focused on the wrong things, winning some amazing brands. I mean, we had the opportunity to do work with some absolutely remarkable organizations in our time. We won some really great awards. We were recognized by Vodacom as their CEO Business Partner of the Year award, their top supplier out of 2,500 suppliers. That was a big deal for us. I think that was in 2013 or 2014. So we had some really great moments. And then obviously selling the business to somebody who decided that it was worth buying was a massive highlight, yeah.
Now tell me, in your early days, who inspired you?
Gosh, again, Dr. Nick, very difficult to... I've always been inspired by people who I can identify with. So while the world is full of business people and leaders that are absolutely extraordinary and have done really incredible things, I don't often idolize those people because for a variety of reasons, their context is very different. And so, for example, as a digital entrepreneur, I never looked to Mark Zuckerberg as inspiration. Mark had a very different journey to mine in a very different context. But I looked to people like, let's say, Rob Stokes or Justin Spratt, or people locally that I thought had succeeded or exceeded expectations in the context that they were in, because they'd found a way to utilize resources and to leverage resources in very interesting ways to produce very valuable businesses. So the people that I looked up to were people often that I identified with, that were closer to me. I think one of the things we do wrong as leaders is we idolize leaders whose contexts are very different to us. And in doing so, we try and transplant ideas and ideologies that often aren't suitable to our contexts. And sometimes we lead poorly because we're trying to be somebody we're absolutely not. And so one of the ideals that I learned very early on was find people who've succeeded in the context that is similar to yours, identify the things that are intrinsic to their leadership style that could be useful for you, and then embrace that and build on it.
Now, Mike, looking back over your career, what would you say, was there a major turning point or maybe a number of turning points?
I wouldn't say there was ever a massive pivot or we were lucky that we found a business model early on that worked very well, and there was a distinct customer need, and we just tried to get better and better at it. So instead of big turning points, there were more kind of focal points, parts of the journey where we opted to narrow our focus and be more deliberate. And certainly as a leader, I learned over the years that, to the earlier point that I made, that being a great leader was more about understanding who I was and refining my strengths and building teams around me that could make up for the parts where I was weak, rather than trying to emulate the behaviors of a person that was completely unlike me or in a different arena or different industry or whatever it might be. So the big turning points for me were points of kind of self-awareness and self-actualization. And sometimes those come through really painful engagements. I remember sitting down with two very senior members of the Cerebra team, kind of around about 2011, 2012. And these two guys sat me down, and then it felt like a meeting where somebody was going to resign. It felt like one of the two guys was going to resign. And I remember thinking at the time that it would have been catastrophic to us. So I kind of prepared myself for them to go, hey, look, here's the big news. One of us is leaving. And it wasn't that. They said, we're committed. Why aren't you? Why aren't you showing up? Why are you distracted? We need you in this business. We need your presence. We need you to practice that presence. We need you visible to us. You need to understand that when you walk in the door in the morning with a gray cloud over your head, that has an instant impact on everybody in this building. And it was really tough to hear. I immediately wanted to be defensive and go, well, this is my business. I built it. I'll behave how I want. And I realized that if I was willing to sit back and listen to that feedback and hear it and know where it was coming from, there were really powerful lessons in there for me about how much of a responsibility I had as a leader and how I was flaunting that responsibility in my behavior. So that was tough to hear, but really valuable to hear. So the biggest moments for me, kind of in summary, were moments where I was forced to examine my approach and what I believed good leadership and good entrepreneurship was, and then recalibrate it based on what I was learning. And often that was about understanding my own strengths and weaknesses. Yeah.
So Mike, what would you say is driving you today?
Passing my degree. So I left Cerebra at the end of last year, just to provide your listeners with some context. And I'm busy learning a whole new category of things by doing a social entrepreneurship degree with the London School of Economics. And I think what motivates me at the moment is again, and I'm going to use this word a lot, but it's an important word, is context, right? So I'm hugely excited by South Africa, and by extension, hugely excited about Johannesburg as a city. And that could be because this is where I grew up and it's all I really know. I mean, I have been lucky enough to travel fairly extensively, but I feel like this is a very unique place with kind of embedded opportunity, huge conflict, massive tensions that create space for innovative and optimistic people to develop and create really exciting solutions. I'm hopefully not completely delusional in that, but I think that there is a massive opportunity for South Africans, and especially well-meaning, well-resourced, well-educated South Africans, to focus on this idea of creating value and networks of value rather than creating short-term wealth and short-term gain. And I don't know if there's a place in the world that's better primed for that right now. You know, this is a place where if you've got the right amount of grit and perseverance and deliberation, that it really it rewards that. And the more we club together, the more we find like-minded people who are trying to create those same value networks and trying to squeeze the life out of some very challenging situations, the more I see magic happening, right? I still think it's easier to make 100 Rand than it is to make $1 American. And so on a very practical and pragmatic level, as an entrepreneur, I think this is an exciting place to be in right now. But on a broader level, I think I remain very optimistic about the promise of this place that we call home. That could be very short-sighted, and I'm aware of that. But it's a cautious optimism, and I like to embrace that.
Well, that's great to hear. So, Mike, let's talk about leadership.
Yeah.
What does the future of leadership mean to you?
So I think I've had the luxury of thinking about leadership a lot since leaving Cerebra. You know, often in a vacuum, you discover things you didn't see when you were in a situation, right? And I think one of the things I'm learning about leadership is kind of that first point that I made earlier on, is that the people that we uphold as great leaders often aren't, and that's not because they're not great leaders, it's because they're great leaders in their context and not necessarily in our context. So I think we need to be careful about who we emulate and who we idolize as leaders, because often the rules that they apply to their context don't necessarily work in ours. The second one is a fairly academic point around some work and research that I've been doing into a field of interest called adult development theory, which is work that has been refined over the years by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Keegan. And I heard about it for the first time on a podcast, a Farnham Street Knowledge Project podcast. The title of the podcast was The Mental Habits of Effective Leaders. And the guest on the podcast was a lady by the name of Jennifer Garvey Berger, who... It is one of the best pieces of content I've discovered on the internet in the last 5 years. Never mind one of the best podcasts. But she spoke about applying this adult development theory to leadership, and essentially 5 stages of adult mind frames, worldviews, how we make sense of the world around us, and how we process information and relationships and experiences based on the mindset that we occupy. And I can't go into intricate detail now, but I'd really encourage your listeners to either go find the podcast or to follow Jennifer Berger online. She has a company called Cultivating Leadership, which does some really exciting work in this field. But essentially, she talks about the socialized mind, the self-transforming mind, and the self-authoring mind. I got those in the wrong order, but I'll put them in the right order now. The socialized mind is a mind that defines its value and identity largely based on the audiences that it connects with, right? So I form my principles and ideologies and values based on the community that I'm a part of. So if I'm a part of a community of people that believe strongly in women's rights and in equality and in a number of other premises, then I will begin to take on those principles as my own, because in that community I find my value and I find my meaning and my identity. And that's a really powerful identity, but it's based largely in the external environment and not in the self. I find my meaning and validation in other people's views of me, right? The self-authoring mind is a slightly more mature phase that says, I am an individual. I am not my feelings. I have feelings. I am not my ideologies. I have beliefs and ideologies, and I can define those, and I can define my values, and I can be very stringent about that and almost militant about what I stand for. And I think a lot of effective leaders in the world today are in this space where they are, this is what I believe, this is who I am, this is what's important to my organization, and they are very strong personalities in enforcing that. The danger with that is that it swings so much to the individual side that sometimes we lose the perspective that comes with applying empathy to somebody else's context. Her belief is that the future leader is the leader that is self-transforming, that can occupy a space of dichotomy and contradiction on a daily basis, depending on the situation that we're in, right? So I can occupy a space where I largely identify with a liberal worldview, let's say, and I'm all about equality and I'm all about freedom and freedom of speech or whatever, but I can also occupy the mindset of another person who might have an opposing view, and I can look at their view separate from the person. I don't have to reduce the person to the view. And in that dynamic, in that tension, I can create really exciting, really valuable views of the world. It's sometimes an uncomfortable thing, and it's hugely demanding of energy and emotional intelligence. But occupying this kind of space of tension is a very powerful way, I think, to lead. And I think because of how complex the world has become, because of how many contradictory pieces of information are coming into our brains on a daily basis, I think the kind of leader that will thrive in the future is one that can occupy a self-transforming state on a regular and ready basis in order to process massive contradictions and massive dichotomies and hold those in tension in a creative way to create value in the world. So that's the second point. The third point, so the first one was around who we idolize. The second one was this idea of adult development theory. The third one would be, I think we need to recognize that some leaders are assholes and that's okay. Because we talk a lot about authentic leadership today, like one of the intrinsic characteristics of authenticity has to be goodness, and it doesn't. You don't have to be good to be a good leader. And I know that sounds weird, and I know that sounds, but there are a lot of people in this world that are highly effective leaders, whether in business or politics or even civil society, who are fundamentally assholes. But they're effective leaders because they are open about the fact that they're an asshole, and they're quite kind of clear about that. And it's a take it or leave it situation. But I will take you somewhere. I have a vision, and I will get you there. And I think we have to stop believing that all leaders have to be good. Some leaders can just be transparent, authentic, and deliberate about how they achieve their goals, and that is just as effective as somebody who is highly conscious and highly cognitive and very considerate of the world around them. In fact, sometimes from a leadership perspective, your goodness can get in the way. You can be so preoccupied with others' well-being that you forget about the task that you're trying to achieve. So it's a slightly controversial view and maybe something we could debate. But I do believe that we need to recognize that a lot of people who are successful in the world today aren't successful because they are good. And that's a pity, because it would be nice if being good and being successful were highly correlated. But that's not necessarily the case. That there's a book that needs to be written about leaders or assholes. And I think it would be an interesting one. But yeah, those are the three things that I think about when I think about leadership.
So Mike, what have you learned from your own journey that you consider most important for building future leaders?
I think the thing that I'd want to share now, like today, because I think if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, I might have had a different answer. And 10 years before that, I might have had a different answer as well. But today, I think the most important thing a leader can do, a natural leader, somebody who has an audience, somebody who has influence, somebody who has responsibility and accountability for a group of people, for an entity. The most important thing that you can do with a leader today is engage in opinions and information that is contradictory to what you believe. Challenge your worldviews, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult that might be to do, or energy expending it might be to do. But avoid creating echo chambers, avoid creating boards of people around you that agree with everything you say. Entertain the dissenting voice, entertain the contradictory opinion, and try and understand why that person has that view. And sit with it and meditate on it, and then make your decision and then move forward. But something happened in the 70s and 80s where we believed that leadership was about ignoring the dissenting voice and just commanding and conquering. But that kind of has its own faults and its own shortcomings. And while it might be effective to a degree, it hasn't really created a highly sustainable world around us. And I think we need to be more aware of the respectful dissenting voice. And unfortunately, there are a lot of environments today where you can hear a dissenting voice, like social media, that aren't respectful. But to look for the contradictory opinion. You know, I partly because I'm studying, but partly because I think it's a good place to process information, and reading more and more peer-reviewed journal based articles and research reports and so on. And when I feel strongly about something, when I have a strong opinion on something, one of the first things I want to do is engage with information that has research and data and information behind it that might be contradictory to that thing that I believe. But our beliefs are the most powerful and most destructive thing in the world today. The things that we believe as leaders will make us and break us. We have to be incredibly conscious of what we believe, and incredibly conscious of things we believe are true that aren't necessarily backed by data, because those are the things that ultimately will decide our value to the world around us.
Now, Mike, when you speak to future leaders, what is it you tell them they should focus on for future-proofing their career?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And again, it's contextual, right? So if I was speaking to a group of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, because of that ecosystem and context, I would be giving very different advice to what I might be giving to guys here. But what I'd be giving to guys here is focus on value creation rather than short-term wealth creation. Consider the long game. Your business doesn't have to be sold to be a good business. Your people are real assets, and if you can find a way to create value for a larger group of people, that will have a massive sustainable impact on your value creation potential. It's not all about how much you have. I find that the more we take, the less we have, right? Like, especially as leaders, the more we grab from the world, the more we extract, the less we actually have in the long run, right? So my big, and I stole that quote, by the way, it's important to admit, from Kung Fu Panda 3 and Master Oogway, who says that to Kai, his mortal enemy. He says, why don't you learn that the more we take, the less we have?
Is that from a movie?
Oh, I'm pretty sure that every leadership lesson anybody ever needs to learn can be learned from the 3 Kung Fu Panda. That's a blog post I need to write, actually. 3 Kung Fu Panda movies, Kung Fu Panda 1, 2, and 3, all the leadership lessons I think anybody needs to know are in those 3 movies. Yeah, but the more we take, the less we have. And I think that especially in South Africa, and especially in a place where there is so much, nothing is simple, nothing is clear-cut. Nothing is obvious here. Everything is complicated, and for good reason. Right? We've got a really interesting history, a really checkered background, and we need to really engage with that as leaders if we are interested in being successful and being significant in this context. And I think that's exciting, and who wouldn't want to be a part of that?
Now, Mike, let's touch on technology.
Oh, great! Yeah.
And what would you say in a leadership context are the key tools of technology that future leaders should embrace and learn?
Wow, I'd say very little, to be honest. I remain quite skeptical of technology as a deus ex machina for the leadership world. I think that technology is an enabler. And I think it's an amplifier, right? If you are a shitty leader and you hop on Twitter and you use Twitter, that technology is going to amplify your dysfunction as a leadership, not solve it, not fix it, right? That's a very superficial and simplistic example. But I read a great quote the other day, and I was doing some research around a digital transformation program that I'm putting together. And the quote said, unless a piece of technology is proprietary to an organization, unless it's your packaged, protected IP, it is in no way, shape, or form ever going to be a strategic differentiator. Technology is only an enabler, not a differentiator. So when I think about what leaders need to embrace in order to be more effective leaders, I think it's got to be technologies that amplify their strengths. And that's more about knowing what you're good at than trying to use a new technology stack to solve operational dysfunction in your business, or using voice technology to solve your morning routine. None of these things are quick fixes. They are all there to empower and support our existing strengths. And also we need to be very careful, amplify our weaknesses. So we need to be very conscious of that. Technology is a helper. Technology is an enabler, not in and of itself a differentiator.
So is it fair to say that all this talk about digital transformation is overrated?
I don't know if it's over. I think it's very important, but I think a lot of what we call digital transformation isn't digital transformation. And I think it's worthwhile stopping, thinking about what transformation actually means, and being very clear on the definition of that, and then going, well, what the hell do we mean by digital? And what we're learning more and more is that, digital is not really a thing. It's not a platform. It's not a mobile device. It's not a channel. It's not even a category or strategy. It's a way of thinking about things. It's a way of applying your mind to problems and to realities and to different contexts, right? So more and more, I think we can stop talking about digital as a thing and rather as a way of doing things as leaders. And I think that fundamentally shifts the role that technology plays, especially in big, hard to move organizations. So that's the work I'm trying to do, is trying to define what technology and digital looks like when we think of it as a way of doing things rather than a set of things we can buy and deploy. And that's really exciting work.
Now, Mike, when it comes to social media, what would you tell future leaders? How should they handle and embrace social media to build their personal brand?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question for me to answer because, to be frank, Dr. Nick, I've lost so much faith in social media over the last couple of years, and now I'm kind of sad about that, man. I'm like almost grieving. These things were a big part of my life for a very long time, and I've watched them become very destructive, very twisted in terms of kind of the dark side, but also twisted in terms of business model. Like they have really weak business models, and those really weak business models produce really bad or encourage really poor behavior, right? There are exceptions to that rule. We spoke very briefly before the podcast around LinkedIn and how powerful a platform that's become for leadership and for communication and for engagement, because it rewards the right kinds of behaviors, I believe. And so, I really would encourage leaders to invest time and energy in understanding the role of LinkedIn for them personally and then for their businesses by extension. But I would caution leaders in pretty much every other capacity around how they consider the time and energy they spend on social media and how they allow that time and energy to inform the way they see the world. Because if you want to, you can make it that social media highly enforces and endorses the way you see the world. It can be the thing that completely convinces you that you're right about that thing that you believe. Or it can be the thing that breaks that thing that you hold as a core belief. I think we need to be really careful with that. Social media is one of the most important, influential, dangerous, frightening things on the planet right now, and I really hope that we'll see it grow into something more mature and more sustainable and more valuable. But right now, I would caution leaders against anything but LinkedIn, I guess.
Now, Mike,
and that's partly because I love Microsoft as a business. So I'm a huge fan of them as an organization. Yeah.
Mike, as a mentor to future leaders, can you maybe share a success story or two where you mentored somebody and that person took your advice to heart?
Yeah, I think, Dr. Nick, most stories that I'll share there were stories where I'd worked with leaders within Cerebra and leaders that I hoped would be able to take over the mantle once I left. And what's been most exciting and I'm by no means a great mentor, so I've got a lot to learn about being that kind of person in a relationship. But I think what I've learned is that it's really exciting when you can help somebody be more of themselves rather than a version of you. I think a lot of mentors try and fashion their mentee into a version of themselves or into a version of somebody else they read about in a book. But again, and I'm going to say it again, this is from Kung Fu Panda. This I'm not even kidding, but this is I really need to write that blog post, don't I? This is a point around the job of the mentor is to help the individual to become the best version of themselves, not a bastardized version of the mentor. And when I saw leaders within our business take on that responsibility and become a better version of themselves, even if sometimes they would make decisions that I fundamentally disagreed with, because I was like, I wouldn't have done that. And then I watched how that decision was much better for the situation than if I'd made it. And I was like, wow. You get to the point where you think you know everything and you think you know what the right decision and the right course of action is. But when you allow a person to become a really great leader in their own right, they show you that there are other routes to that solution. And that's hugely humbling and really edifying. But those would be the highlight moments where I see them becoming better versions of who they already are.
Now, Mike, are there any role models of leadership or maybe books about leadership that you would recommend future leaders should study?
Geez, there are tons, and it's hard to even know where to start on that. And I've read so many books over the last couple of years that have informed to a greater or lesser degree my view on leadership, and a lot of them, I would argue, have also taught me a lot about how not to lead. Right, so one of my favorite business books of recent times is a book by Peter Thiel, who's a person I don't necessarily believe in as a leader, but I enjoyed the book. The book is 0 to 1, and it taught me as much about smart ideas of how to build a startup as it did about how not to lead a company. So it's interesting that sometimes I'm really interested in the work that the chaps from 37 Signals are doing, Jason Fried and them, their book, Rework, and a couple of other books, I can't remember the title of the other one, are really great. The Hard Thing About Hard Things is a book that I really enjoyed and has informed a lot of how I think about leadership. And then I'd listen to a ton of podcasts. I go looking for leadership podcasts. That's how I found the one with Jennifer Berger. And once I found that, then what I could do was, okay, I'm really interested in this theory as a model for leadership, and then I could go and find some of the research and some of the academic documentation that supports it. And I actually, to be honest with you, get far more value out of that than I do out of business books. A lot of business books, I feel today, could have been a blog post instead of an entire business book, and it's almost like the first 2 or 3 chapters are really interesting, and then the next 7 or 8 chapters are just case studies trying to prove the first 2 or 3 chapters. But so that's one of the first things I do. The second thing I would encourage people to do is to understand tools for self-awareness better. So personality profiling tools like the Enneagram or like StrengthsFinder or any of the other, even the old Myers-Briggs stuff. But go and engage in those tools. Go and understand how they work. Maybe conduct 1 or 2. Don't do the free test online because that'll give you a bad view. But go and do those tests. Learn about how your mind works. Learn about who you are. Learn about your motivations. The more self-aware you are, I think the better equipped you are to be a leader in today's world. And that's certainly been a huge asset for me.
Now, Mike, how can our listeners connect with you, and where should they follow you?
Yes, I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. I'm Mike Stopforth, MikeStopforth on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Those are probably the easiest places to reach me. I'm also available on email if they would like to connect with me there, mike@beyondbinary.co.za. But yeah, social media is always the quickest way to get my attention, so I'd encourage them to reach out there.
And Mike, last but not least, is there one piece of advice that you would really like to convey to future leaders that they should implement in their own life?
Absolutely. Watch all 3 of the Kung Fu Panda movies. No, let me be serious about that. I really do mean that. But listen, learn, challenge your beliefs, be hard on your opinions, and the world provides us with an extraordinary opportunity today to grow as leaders. Grab that opportunity and embrace it, and make sure you're moving forward.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom and your leadership journey, and reminding us that leadership is set in context. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nick.